My name is Beth Wemegwas. I am the program coordinator and curator here at the Harbor Springs Area Historical Society. And the Harbor Springs Area Historical Society, I know many of you know all about us, but for those of you who have maybe never Zoomed with us before, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We operate the Harbor Springs History Museum, and we are also working with the city of Harbor Springs to operate the Andrew J. Blackbird Museum and to keep that open. We are also working on a restoration of the Ephraim Shea Hexagon House with the intent that in, say, early 2025, we will be opening the Ephraim Shea Innovation Museum. Those are just some of the sites that we operate, and we are Gosh, we're just busy. We have so much going on, and we're so glad that you can join us for some of it. We have monthly lectures and other events that you can learn more about on our website, which is harborspringshistory.org. We are also on Facebook, on Instagram, and on YouTube. So, in case you didn't know, especially with YouTube, if you've missed other lectures in the past or missed some of these Zoom lectures in the past, you can find us on YouTube. Just go to YouTube and put in Harbor Springs Area Historical Society, and we will pop up and you will see that we have lectures from the past couple of years up there that you have a chance to see. This lecture will also be up on YouTube after I get a chance to get it edited and get it up there. So we hope that you will take a moment and visit us at all of those places and to be able to join us for many other Zooms and events in the future. Especially as we go into fall and the winter, we tend to move some of our history talks, especially to Zoom, just so that we are able to get as many people as possible involved. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say about me and my background. Again, I'm Beth Wemegwas. I've been here going on 11 years now, so it's been quite a while. This will be my third Lighthouse tour, so I'm looking forward to seeing you all and having you experience the Lighthouse as well. So on to tonight's program. We're going to go ahead and dive right into it. Lighting the Way, the Harbor Point Association and its lighthouse. So we start where every good story should start, at the beginning. And the beginnings of the story of Harbor Point really go back quite a way. And one of the first stories that I've heard about Harbor Point is actually an Odawa legend. And it's reprinted in this little booklet called In Tranquil Refuge, The Story of Harbor Point, which was a series of articles published in the local newspaper that were then compiled into this little souvenir booklet. And from there is where I got the story of Harbor Point. And the Odawa story goes that there was a great spirit or a great Manitou who was in the region at the time. And the thing that he loved most in the world was his daughter, his beautiful daughter. Of course, daughters being daughters, she fell in love with a mortal of all things. And she fled with her mortal lover from Mackinac Island, where she and her great spirit father lived, to an island that was out in Little Traverse Bay, and that island was Harbor Point. And she and the mortal built a lodge together and got married and lived happily there for many years until her father found them again. And the Great Spirit took his daughter back and held her captive and told the hero of our story that he would never see his beloved again until the island was connected to the mainland. And the hero labored for many, many years, decades even, to fill up the land between the island and the mainland. And eventually he succeeded for the most part, except for one area that is called Devil's Pond. And Devil's Pond, no matter how much sawdust he poured in from the lumber mills, no matter how much soil he moved, was never able to be filled in. And what's interesting is that on early plat maps and drawings of Harbor Point, you can see Devil's Pond. And apparently, I talked to someone who still lives on Harbor Point. They said that that area, which is now filled in, still causes constant drainage and water problems to this day. So that is the early story of Harbor Point and how this peninsula of Harbor Point became a peninsula. I love that legend. I think it's fantastic and much more exciting than the geological standpoint, which says that Harbor Point is what's called a recurved sand spit. Basically, the waves and the wind pushing into Little Traverse Bay and into the harbor hit a sort of shallower area, and slowly over thousands of years that sand builds up and created this peninsula, and also created our nice sheltered harbor. And this is what Harbor Point looked like. In about 1875 is when this picture is from that you see here. So backtracking a tiny bit from 1875, the date of this picture, what many of you might recognize in the picture if you've been to Harbor Springs is Holy Childhood Church, which is right here, Holy Childhood Church and School. And the beginnings of Holy Childhood Church and School really come in 1829. So we have these stories about this area. And of course, the Odawa had been here for thousands of years prior to European involvement. And in 1829, there was quite a threat of removal. The Indian Removal Act would be signed in 1830 and made into law. And a group of Catholic Odawa split from a larger group at the Goodhart Middle Village, Cross Village area and moved to a place they called Weequatonson. And Weequatonson means small bay place or little bay place in the Odawa language. And they built Holy Childhood Church and established basically a European style settlement. This was a very calculated move on the part of the Odawa to set up what was an Americanized, civilized town, convert to Catholicism, give up many of their traditional beliefs, all in an effort to stay on Little Traverse Bay. So we get Weequatonson in 1829, and later in 1861, the town is renamed to Little Traverse. And later in 1881, we change our name again to Harbor Springs. So throughout all of that time, we have this little settlement right here, but nothing going on the point. So again, this image here is from 1875, and you can see the point is just this wooded, dense wilderness at this time. And here's another image that you can see that shows Harbor Point. This is from a 1902 plat map, so quite a bit later, but it really shows you the peninsula itself and the shape of the peninsula. And Devil's Pond would have been right about here where my cursor is on the screen. So in sometime around 1855, this gentleman on the left here moves to the area. This is Father Reverend Wycamp. Wycamp was a very interesting fella, but he moved to the area intent on starting a convent. And he, it is said, was the original purchaser of the property of Harbor Point, of that land from the Odawa Indians. And he purchased it, and we don't know exactly when, but shortly thereafter, shortly after 1855, after purchasing the property, he decides that Cross Village is a better location for his convent. And he does indeed open it. He opens the Benevolent, Charitable, and Religious Society of St. Francis. Now, this is no small convent. This is 2,000 acres of land, including the convent, but it also had a sawmill, a blacksmith shop, a granary, a hospital, a school, and so much more. So he really expanded out in Cross Village. So he was the first person who was not an Odawa to own land on the point. Because he no longer needed it for his convent, because he'd moved it to Cross Village, he ends up selling the point to a group of businessmen from Lansing. Now, this group of businessmen had come up to the area and camped on Harbor Point, and they loved it so much. They loved this barren, beautiful wilderness so much that they purchased it from Father Wycamp in order to start the Harbor Point Association. So at this point in the story, we're going to backtrack a tiny bit with the question, why is this group of gentlemen, well-to-do, wealthy gentlemen from Lansing, why are they camping in the middle of nowhere, northern Michigan, in this tiny little town that at this point was really very small. It's an up and coming logging town, but would you want to go on vacation to a logging town in the middle of the wilderness? I don't know. So why were they coming here? And that answer is sort of, I would say, maybe twofold. So around this time, this is the 1870s now that we're talking about. In the 1870s, our nation is undergoing increasing industrialization, increasing urbanization, and there is really a lot of unpleasantness in the cities. They're crowded, they're dirty, they're rapidly growing. And hand in hand with that sort of uh, grunginess, I would call it, in the cities, there was this renewed interest in health and a strong belief that the environment itself could cure certain diseases. And so the Victorians of this era decided to take things back to nature, basically. You can see them here in their corsets and their beautiful dresses out here just roughing it, camping in tents, hunting, fishing, cooking over open fires. And this is sort of one of the first, what I would call wellness crazes of the Victorian era. Taking the waters was seen as extremely healthful, and places like Dr. John Harvey Kellogg's Medical and Surgical Sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan opened up. And he had all kinds of water baths, from Turkish, Russian, Roman, solar, and electric to electro vapor. And all of these things were tied to this desire to cleanse the body and the mind of all of this industrial dirt that they were picking up in the cities. And, um, at first, this sort of interest in camping and going back to nature is a little bit baffling. But when seen from the perspective of getting out of those really, really tight, cramped, dirty quarters in the cities, it makes a lot more sense. And I love this quote from an author of the time who writes, "I suspect that many of us are, after all, really camping temporarily in civilized conditions, and that going into the wilderness is an escape longed for into our natural and preferred state." This is a quote from 1878, and that sort of movement really fuels the creation of our first national parks. It's actually in 1872 that President Grant designates Yellowstone as our first national park. The second national park was actually Mackinac Island, which was transferred to a state park in 1895, but prior to that was one of our first national parks. And so this is the 1870s. We have a new national park here in northern Michigan. There's this extreme interest in health, in wellness, and in the belief that clean water and pure air could cure you of ailments like tuberculosis and hay fever and asthma. And so going north and getting back to nature was extremely popular at the time. At the same time, as I mentioned, you have the lumber industry going on here in northern Michigan, but it's beginning to wane. And many of these railroad companies who had invested really just a ton of time, capital into building logging railroads started carrying passengers instead in order to sort of ride this wave, this health craze. It's what I would call sort of the first Pure Michigan campaign. I don't think they called it that at the time, but I don't think it's copyrighted either. I don't know. So, steamship companies, railroad companies, basically any company involved in transportation or tourism really got in on this craze, and they started marketing northern Michigan really heavily in the 1870s going into the 1880s. And we'll come back to this image in a little while, but the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad was the main transportation company that fueled this marketing. And these companies got together and built places like the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island at the very end of their route to encourage people to travel on their transportation lines. So that's why the group of Lansing businessmen were in northern Michigan. They were here as an escape from the industrial life and busy business life that they led otherwise. And they really did pitch tents and camp out on Harbor Point in their beautiful suits. And it was in 1878 that they officially purchased the Harbor Point Association and founded their association. They decided to form the association as a stock company for the care and improvement of the property itself. They organized under the statutes of Michigan with originally their capital stock was $2,500. And that was divided into shares of $25 each. Now, each stockholder was required to have at least 4 of those shares, so it would have cost you $100. And at that point, you were entitled to use one of the lots on the association grounds for a tent or a cottage that you would hope to put up. And you could also board at the hotel that they were soon to build. And there's a picture of that here on the left. This is the first hotel, which they called the Clubhouse, um, on Harbor Point, and it was one of the very first things they did. So 1878, they're founded. 1878, they built the clubhouse as well. This postcard on the right is just an example of what I would call the foresight of these founders. They didn't just put up houses and cabins willy-nilly on this point of land. They hired John Swift, a local landscape architect and surveyor, to design their resort and lay it out. And they did things like provided locations for the clubhouse, reserves for open natural space, designed the carriage lanes, and laid out the cottages. And we'll just jump back again to this image here of the plat map. And again, it's 1902, so it's a little bit later in time, but you can see all of these carefully mapped out carriage lanes and where the hotel or clubhouse was originally located. And you can see that they have left a lot of the point itself natural. And that was really an informed decision. They wanted it to retain its natural beauty. They didn't want to, clear cut the place. Here are a few more images of the clubhouse itself. The clubhouse originally had only 22 rooms. After its final remodel, which happened in 1911, it had 66 rooms. And eventually they decided that the old clubhouse was no longer big enough. They tore it down and built another one in 1896 on the same location, just a bigger structure. Now, as I mentioned, the clubhouse was for shareholders to board at, and that really was its main purpose. And again, that purpose is twofold. If you had guests who you were going to entice to potentially buy shares in your association, you would have them come up and have someplace lovely for them to stay to encourage them to buy a plot of their own and build a cottage on it. Also, many of these early cottages were very quickly built affairs. They could be built in as little as a month, sometimes less. They're not insulated, they're just studs, just a little bit better than a tent is what I would call it. And they certainly didn't have kitchens. If they did, it was maybe a summer kitchen off, off the side of the home. And so most people ate dinner and most of their meals at the clubhouse itself. So it served both of those purposes. I love this image of the veranda on the original clubhouse building there. Now, the clubhouse also served for a long time as the main entertainment venue as well. But eventually, it was also deemed too small for that purpose, and they built what was called variously the entertainment hall, the assembly hall, or the casino. And casino doesn't mean, as we would think of it today, as some place where you would gamble. It just meant a place where you held entertainments. This is a lovely little article from the local newspaper, the Daily Resorter, published in 1896, that mentions the first informal hop of the season will be given in the Harbor Point Pavilion tonight. Progressive whist parties have been the evening amusement of guests and cottage goers so far, but the young people have been anxiously awaiting the opening of the tennis grounds and dancing pavilion. So you can see all of these people here just waiting to use that entertainment hall. There was actually a bowling alley on the lower level, and then the upper level was used for dances and other gatherings. And this is the water right here on the right. It's a little bit difficult to see, But this is the assembly hall. And going back one more time to that map, it would be located right here. And that building is still standing. So any of you who are on the tour tomorrow, you will pass it. The clubhouse itself was torn down, unfortunately, in about 1963, 1964. At that point, it was a huge hotel with very little purpose. By the 1960s, most cottages on Harbor Point have gone from being these quickly built small affairs to really grand homes that certainly have their own kitchens and have plenty of guest rooms as well. And the clubhouse's expense to maintain no longer justified having it. It was deteriorating badly and really could not be saved and was torn down. These are just some fun scenes from Harbor Point that I wanted to include. I love this dock. I just think it's beautiful. You can see there's a few other docks down the way, and all of these boating parties going out to canoe and paddle around the harbor. This is one of my other favorite images of Harbor Point. This is the dock at Harbor Point. Again, if you are on the Lighthouse tour tomorrow, you'll see that the dock now ends at about here. There's no longer a dock there, but you'll see the concrete evidence of where it used to be. And you can see just how busy the harbor was. This is the Silver Spray, which was a ferry that went just around Little Traverse Bay. So from, say, Harbor Springs to Petoskey or Roaring Brook to Bayview. And Harbor Point for many years existed simply as a resort association. But that was to change because the Harbor Point itself was a very important in a very important place, which we'll talk about in just a second. But there was talk of having a lighthouse at the end of the Harbor Point Peninsula, you know, really as early as it was settled. But it's not until 1882, 1883 that the United States government and their lighthouse keeping service finally gets around to deciding that, yes, we need a lighthouse here and we're going to build one. And so in October of 1883, the government purchases 3.5 acres on the point from the association to create their lighthouse, because remember, the association came first. So the government purchases this property, and in May, it's on May 14th, 1884, workmen and materials begin landing at the site, and activity continues throughout the coming weeks. The lighthouse is completed by August 18th. That is just 96 days before they had the lighthouse complete. And the first lightkeeper, who we are going to come back to in a second, is this lovely lady here, Elizabeth Whitney Williams. And I just wanted to read you some of these newspaper articles. They're all from a local paper called the Northern Independent that was published right here in Harbor Springs. Starting in 1883, we have a couple notes about Mr. A.R. Flint, a civil engineer from Detroit, arriving for the purposes of making the surveys for the lighthouse on Harbor Point. Later, it says that the site for the Harbor Point Lighthouse has been surveyed and all sketched out. The association, however, reserves a 50-foot drive between the government land and the beach. Now, once more, we're hopping back to this 1902 plat map because this says reserved by association. So in 1902, on that plat map, they're still showing that the association is reserving that little tip of land at the very end for a drive. By 1884, we have information about the lighthouse actually being built. So stone is being hauled for the foundation of the lighthouse. The government barge Warrington was in Saturday with the lamp for the lighthouse, which I think is fantastic that the lamp was getting there. And then finally, in August, we have a note that the lighthouse is receiving its finishing touches. The lamp is being placed in position today, and the lightkeeper will begin her duties in a few weeks. And that was the lightkeeper right there. So here's the lighthouse. We finally have it. It is built, the Little Traverse Lighthouse. It is a beautiful place. The lighthouse itself is built of red brick that is about 12 inches thick, and those walls are supported by stone 20 inches thick. So it's quite quite the structure, quite the fortress. The tower here is 40 feet tall, and there's a 10-sided lantern room at the very top that houses a fourth order Fresnel lens. We'll talk about the Fresnel lens a little bit later. And this image I love. This is just showing ice at the end of the point, and you can see the lighthouse here in the background. And it's very difficult to see, probably especially for you on your screens, but this says it's a view of the ice taken by D. Williams, Harbor Point, Michigan. And D. Williams is Daniel Williams. And Mr. Daniel Williams was a local photographer, and Elizabeth Whitney Williams, the lightkeeper's second husband. And we have quite a few images of the lighthouse itself and of the surrounding area of Harbor Springs that come from Daniel. This is him and Elizabeth, obviously much later in their lives, pictured together at their home in Charlevoix, which is where they retired to once they stopped keeping the light. Now, we also think that this person in this door here might be Elizabeth, but we're not positive. And again, this is one of Daniel's images. And some of the things you can see in this image that I wanted to point out includes what was called the summer kitchen and a wood shop, which would actually later become a barn. So in 1894, we have a report from the Lighthouse Board that the woodshed attached to the keeper's dwelling was moved and the structure was converted to a barn. That barn is still on the property and was restored, and you will see it tomorrow if you're on the tours. This also mentions that the summer kitchen had a hand pump at the sink with water delivered from a cistern underneath the kitchen, which is right in this area here. This lean-to area is the summer kitchen, and there was this covered walkway in between the keeper's dwelling and out to the woodshed and the summer kitchen there. Now, by 1890, Ephraim Shays Waterworks had been extended from Harbor Springs to Harbor Point, and just a year later, the lighthouse was connected to the city waterworks and the city mains to furnish a station with a fresh supply of water for domestic purposes and for protections against fire. These are a few other images that Daniel Williams took. This one on the right actually shows some of the cottages on Harbor Point as seen from the lighthouse itself. So we're standing at the lighthouse looking back at the point. This is cottage number 1. And the lighthouse itself was given the number 00 to designate it, since the cottage itself, which was there first, was 01. This tiny little building that you can see here was the fireproof oil house that stored all of the kerosene. I love this image. This is another showing ice piling up at the end of the point. Another image that Daniel Williams took, obviously from much further away, showing the lighthouse and the fog signal building and many of the cottages on Harbor Point. This is a really spectacular view of Harbor Point that you don't get to see very often. You often see it from the other side, from inside the harbor, looking that way. You don't often see this side of it. And finally, one more. Again, a fantastic image. And this one, and these images are in our archives. I don't know if I mentioned that, but they're in the Historical Society's collection. And the back of this image reads, Harbor Point Lighthouse and Steamer Manitou rounding the point. To Amy and Charlie from Libby and Dan. So we know that Elizabeth Whitney Williams went by the nickname Libby, and her husband went by Dan. And I just thought that was sort of fantastic. Now, Elizabeth Whitney Williams, we're going back to her for a second to talk about her. She's the first keeper at Harbor Point, at the Little Traverse Lighthouse, and she wrote an autobiography called A Child of the Sea and Life Among the Mormons. As the title suggests, most of the book talks about her time on Beaver Island under King Strang, the Mormon king. She was born originally on Mackinac Island in about 1842, but her family moved to Beaver Island when she was only about 4 years old because her father, a ship's carpenter, found work on the island actually for King Strang. Eventually, of course, tensions and schisms between the Mormons and the non-Mormons resulted in the Whitney family moving first to Charlevoix and later to Traverse City. But after the assassination of King Strang, when the island is sort of released from Mormon control, the family goes back. And shortly after they go back, in about 1860 or so, the dates aren't super firm, but around that time, Elizabeth Whitney Williams, she meets and marries Clement Van Ripper. That is her first husband. He is a cooper who came up from Detroit to the island originally for his health, because he had quite poor health, and he thought that, again, the northern air would help clear that up. While most of the book talks about Elizabeth's life among the Mormons and her childhood as she remembers it, she does write in the last few pages about her time at Little Traverse and Harbor Point, and this is a quote from her book. She says, "On the end of the point stands the lighthouse, with its red light flashing out at night over the waters, looking like a great red ruby set with diamonds as the electric lights are shining around the bay and harbor. What more is needed of nature's beauty to make this picture complete?" So originally, on Beaver Island, um, Elizabeth and her husband Clement were neighbors to the McKinneys. And the McKinleys were actually the family who tended the Beaver Island Harbor Lighthouse. The Beaver Island Harbor Lighthouse is also sometimes called the St. James Harbor Light or the Whiskey Point Light. But at the time, the keeper of the light, Peter McKinley, he actually resigns his post due to really poor health, and Clement is appointed in his stead. And that is really Elizabeth's first experience with lighthouse keeping, primarily because her husband is also in very poor health, and often the duties of light keeping fell to her. She took a special pleasure in tending to the cleaning and polishing of the fourth order lens that was at that light. She wrote, "My three brothers were then sailing, and how glad I felt that their eyes might catch the bright rays of our light shining out over the waste of waters on a dark, stormy night." So she took her job quite seriously. And it's a good thing that she did, because in 1872, Clement, who was Elizabeth's first husband, he rowed out into a storm in an attempt to rescue some crew from a stranded ship. And he never returned. His body was never recovered, and the sole duty of keeping the light fell on Elizabeth during that 3-day gale. And she does write about this in her autobiography as well. And she mentions, "The lighthouse was the only home I had, and I was glad and willing to do my best in its service. I now felt a deeper interest in our sailors' lives than ever before, and I longed to do something for humanity's sake." So she was officially appointed as the lighthouse keeper of that lighthouse about a week later, taking over for her deceased husband. And about 3 or 4 years later, she meets and marries Daniel Williams, her second husband. And at that point, a little while later, she does put in a request to go to a mainland station instead of on an island. But she was at the Beaver Island Harbor Light for 12 years, and she spends 29 years at the lighthouse on Harbor Point, which means she was a light keeper for 41 years. Eventually, she does retire. She retires in about 1913, and she and her husband moved to Charlevoix, which is when we see that. I'm going to go back to it, that lovely image of them together. They were both very musical, played the piano, the guitar, the violin, and they lived very happily in retirement, and actually ended up passing away within just a few hours of each other in 1938. So, we're going to backtrack again a tiny bit. We've talked about the lighthouse, we've talked about its first lighthouse keeper. We haven't talked about why we needed a lighthouse, though. Why did we even need a light at the end of Harbor Point? And that's, I think, a very apt question to be asking at this point. And the answer really is in the formation, the geological formation of Harbor Point itself. So Harbor Point as a peninsula really just juts right out into Little Traverse Bay, and it helps protect our harbor itself, which of course is part of our namesake of Harbor Springs. We have one of the deepest natural harbors on the Great Lakes. And that meant that we had a very, very busy harbor. And even in the 1870s, And into the 1880s, ships traffic was just to such an extent that not having a lighthouse at the end of that very, very pronounced peninsula was an extreme hazard. And so building a lighthouse really was essential. So I love some of these pictures. They just show what a busy harbor we had. If you've ever been to Harbor Springs, this is the main city dock right by the Pier restaurant. And this is the Manitou, that ship that we saw rounding the point in one of Daniel Williams' earlier images. The Manitou came from Chicago and could carry 300 to 400 passengers at a time. It was this huge, huge steamship. And coming in right behind it, we have the Northland, which was an even bigger steamship. There were many, many other ships out on the waters. This is a government ship, a Navy ship. And in this image from Harbor Springs in summer in 1913, we get another view of just how busy this harbor was. These are just some of the boats coming into our little harbor. They don't include all of the lumber schooners, all of the pleasure craft, all of the sailboats, all of the ferries going back and forth on a daily basis. And if you had at all inclement weather, storms, fog, if it was at night or getting dark, you really needed that lighthouse. And so that is the reason that the United States government decided to put a light here in the first place, because we were, in fact, a very, very busy place. In fact, we're what's called a safe harbor because we are naturally sheltered, and some of these huge commercial barges sometimes shelter in our harbor during rough weather. This is a picture from about 1952, and this one on the right is from Tuesday. It's not a particularly easy to see picture. I'll blow it up. I was taking this picture out my car window from Harbor Point itself, so it's not that great of an image, but you can see the barge right here, that freighter, hanging out in that safe harbor to get out of some of the storms there. And so, as I mentioned, our harbor was quite busy. And I will go back just quickly. This is the Manitou right here, rounding Harbor Point, just so you could see it. So getting back to the lighthouse itself, in about 1925, the lamp, the fourth order Fresnel lens, and the lamp inside of it, it was converted to a 300-watt electric power with a Type D ruby shade. A few years later, the oil house on the property was demolished. They no longer needed it for the kerosene. And eventually, of course, the light itself was no longer needed. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's not that the light was no longer needed. It's that the lighthouse itself was no longer needed, and it didn't need to be manned anymore. So in 1963, the Coast Guard decommissions the Little Traverse Lighthouse, and instead they purchase about 3.5, well, not 3.5 acres. They purchase this really tiny bit of land right behind the lighthouse and erect this steel skeletal tower that has an electric light that is remotely operated on the top of it there. You can kind of see it a little bit better. And what they did is, in exchange for this piece of land that the skeletal tower is on, they gave the lighthouse property back to the Harbor Point Association. And the Harbor Point Association established its lighthouse committee in order to take proper care of this historic building. And really, their serious restoration efforts began in about 1999. The Fresnel lens, which you can see, it's just a beautiful shot of it here, did remain in the tower. And speaking of Fresnel lenses, they were originally created in about 1822 by Augustin Fresnel in France. And he completed his design, again, roughly 1822, using these really thin shaped glass panels to refract the light both horizontally and vertically, which produced a very strong beam of light. So you can see in this image here, this is all of those panes of glass cut in these very specific ways so that as the light from your lamp, originally fueled by kerosene, shines out, it hits that glass lens and refracts in such a way that it creates this strong beam of light. And that is hundreds of specially cut pieces of glass put together. Fresnel lenses are ranked in what is called order. The largest size is the first order, and they go to the sixth order. I believe, you might not want to quote me on this, but I believe the largest that we have here on the Great Lakes goes up to the third order. I believe the first and second orders are reserved for ocean lights on either of the Pacific or Atlantic coast. The light in the Harbor Point Lighthouse is a fourth order light. And our lens itself has always been what is called a fixed lens, but they do make flashing lenses where the light itself, the panels of glass, move in such a way that the light looks like it is flashing. And there's a mechanism underneath the light itself that originally would have been wound as sort of a clockwork mechanism, but was later, of course, electrified to spin the light as well. But our light here has always been a fixed fourth order Fresnel lens. Some of the other improvements that the Harbor Point Association made came a little bit later. In 2008, they restored the bell tower, and recently it was removed and restored again. But what they did to restore the bell tower itself was they found a Gamwell fog bell striker, which is this thing right here. And the internal mechanisms of that striker you can see here on the right. What you don't see, these chains go down even lower to this sort of huge weight apparatus. It's a lot like a grandfather clock. You had to wind it up, and then it would run, and all of the gears would turn, and this striker would strike the bell itself in foggy weather. The apparatus here, the Stevens fog bell apparatus, and the bell itself were actually transferred from the Manitowoc, Wisconsin breakwater light in 1896. So when the lighthouse was first established in 1884, it was just the lighthouse itself. There had been talk of putting a fog signal building there, but that wasn't realized until 1896 when they finally got it there. The original bell was made in Boston in about 1881 and weighed 1,800 pounds. And the striker itself, which again is powered by weights, sort of like a grandfather clock, was wound up and, about every 3 hours, and would strike about every 15 seconds or every 30 seconds. They could change that timing up during foggy weather. Some of the other things that the Harbor Point Association did, including restoring the barn, which they did in 2010. And in 2011, they actually reconstructed the oil house on its original foundations. It was pretty cool, actually. They did some excavations and found where the oil house had been originally and rebuilt it exactly to what it would have been, restoring the lighthouse to how it would have looked about the time that the fog bell was installed. So the Harbor Point Association's goal was to take the lighthouse back to around 1896 and that sort of time period. And of course, they did quite a bit of work inside. The inside of the lighthouse, the interior, is just filled with period furnishings and photographs and things like that. So this is the image that I wanted to end on. This is two pictures of the lighthouse right before it is decommissioned. In the 1960s, there was an assistant keeper living there named Norman Roosman, and he was living there with his family, and his daughter Tammy actually sent us these images. She was a small child and lived in the lighthouse before it was decommissioned, and she sent us these pictures, and I wanted to share them. You'll notice in this one in particular, this is that barn sort of structure that was eventually moved. Well, this isn't actually, I'm sorry. This was the summer kitchen that was in such bad shape that it was actually taken apart. And this little walkway was taken apart too. So behind it, when you go to the lighthouse today, you enter into what is now displayed as the kitchen through that door there. But I love the little birdhouse and everything in these images. So that took us, yes, 45 minutes. Fantastic. We're on time. That is sort of the conclusion of my presentation. I'm hoping that some of you have questions or comments, and I can go back through some of these images if you're interested. But that is sort of the story, the early beginnings of the Harbor Point Association and the lighthouse itself, why we needed a lighthouse, why people were coming to Harbor Point, and how it has been restored since the Harbor Point Association has taken control of the building from 1963. So I'll wait a second here, and if anybody does have questions, I encourage you to put them in the chat. I do see a fun message that says, when my mother was a little girl, she said passengers would throw pennies off the boats to children on the docks. That is adorable. In this one, you can see that there are quite a few people lining the docks waiting to board the Manitou, and I think that just sounds lovely. Do you have a list of lighthouse keepers? I do have a list of lighthouse keepers. I don't have it in front of me at the moment. That's something that is going to be shared with you on the tour itself. So if you're on the tour, which I believe you are, Brian, you will learn from that as well. Oh, good. We're glad you're looking forward to your tour. Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Let's see. Do we have any more questions? Robert, was it common for women to be lighthouse keepers? Um, that's a good question that sort of has a twofold answer. So Elizabeth here, Elizabeth Whitney Williams, was common in that while women weren't officially lighthouse keepers terribly often, they were often the people doing the work regardless. Really frequently, most light keepers were men, but they almost always had families. And when they were ill or were unable to work, or when they just had too much work, their wives and children often stepped in. And so Elizabeth taking over for her husband during his ill health is the exact same story as Mr. McKinley, the one who handled the Beaver Island Light before her. He resigned his position due to ill health, but prior to that, it was his wife and children who were really working the lighthouse before him. And so that was, it wasn't common for women to be officially appointed as lighthouse keepers, but it was very common for them to be doing the work. And so Elizabeth really is one of the first, and certainly one of the longest serving women lighthouse keepers on the Great Lakes area for certain. Marlene, why is it open only once each year? So the lighthouse itself is part of the Harbor Point Association, which is a private association, and they don't love people to be running past their homes all the time, and they like to remain private, which we completely understand. But they're very generous in that the Harbor Point Association allows us, the Historical Society, to host these tours about once every 3 years as a fundraiser for the Historical Society. And so this is a fundraiser for us, and a great opportunity for people who haven't gotten a chance to see the lighthouse to really get out there and see it. But because it is a privately owned light, it is open much less often. Let's see. In addition to receiving access to the dwelling, were the lighthouse keepers paid a salary? They certainly were. Yes. And their salary could be docked for many different things. And so you'll learn a little bit about this if you're on the tours tomorrow. But they had to keep daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly logs in pen in very neat handwriting of everything that was happening. They often had visitors, either stranded sailors or inspectors who were coming to see that their work was being carried out. And they were paid a fairly good wage, a livable wage for sure, as head light keeper. And there were also assistant keepers and things like that, other positions as well. So Elizabeth Whitney Williams was definitely paid, and her husband was a photographer, but I don't believe he made it a ton of money off of his business. It seems like more of a hobby for him. Let's see, Dawn. Oh, my great and great great grandfathers were keepers on Skilligalee off Cross Village. Yes, yes. Uh, Another one, Mrs. Williams archival material available from somewhere. So most of what we have about Elizabeth Whitney Williams is primarily from in our archives. We have very little from her. We mostly have her husband's photographs. We're very lucky in that we have access to these newspapers that give such rich detail about life during that time. Now, the Beaver Island Historical Society does have some things from their first from her time spending 12 years on the Beaver Island Harbor Light. And so they have some things such as some clothing that she made and things like that there. Now, all of the records that she kept are with the Harbor Point Association as part of their archive at the Lighthouse. All of those records were left with the Lighthouse itself, and they have copies of all of her journals and entries that she made. So if you're on the tour tomorrow, you will actually see those books, and you'll be able to leaf through them and see things like her keeping track of the weather and how many ships came through and how much kerosene she was using in the lamps on those days, which is really fascinating, I think, at least. Let's see. Any other questions? I'm giving people a few more seconds here to type if you'd like to. A quick reminder for those of you who are on this Zoom call, if you're joining us tomorrow for your Lighthouse tour, your tour time, say your tour time is 1:20. That is when the shuttle leaves the museum to go on your tour. So please arrive to the History Museum a little earlier than that so we can get you checked in. Go back to some of these images here. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm seeing some little messages here thanking me for the presentation. Thank you for being a part of our presentation. We're really glad that you were all able to join us tonight. Um, I see a few people joining now, actually, which they might have been on a different time zone than us. But this lecture was recorded and it will be emailed to all of you participants once I get a chance to edit it and get it posted. And let's see. In the picture on the right, what is in the smoke? Oh, this isn't smoke. This is actually ice. I know it's difficult to see, but this is ice. And so it's taken from a viewpoint of you're standing at the very end of the point looking back at the lighthouse, and this is all of that uh the ice there. I hope that's what you meant, at least, Mary. Yes, that is what you meant. Yeah, no, yeah, that's ice, which is, similar to here's this picture showing the ice again. It really builds up at the end of the point, apparently, um, having to have icebreakers come in and break that up. Okay, I don't think I'm seeing any more questions. Um, Thank you all so much for joining us. We really